A proposal to make birth control available directly from pharmacists in New Hampshire is moving forward after winning initial approval in the House. The bill would allow pharmacists to give contraceptives through physician-approved agreements. There are concerns that the bill may expose doctors and pharmacists to liability, but supporters say it would increase access and reduce insurance costs.